Hello, everybody. Sorry this video is a little bit late being put up. I wanted to do it yesterday, but a few things got in the way. So we're going to we're starting the research unit, and there'll be a separate video on that for those of you who are not there on Saturday. But today we're going to look at a really excellent essay that's a mixed genre. So we've talked about the different genres of essays and what it means to mix those genres. This essay has a research component, an argument component, it has an informative component, and it has a personal kind of reflection component as well. So as you look at your research assignment and decide what you want to write about, please consider mixing all these genres. Certainly when your assignment was to read chapter 12 and 13 in the book, which was informative writing and argumentative writing, because we're combining those to do the research essay. But I want you to look at this as an example of an essay that combines even more genres and kind of naturally weaves research through the entire essay. So this is called Incarceration, Education, and Emancipation by Eric and Madam. Emancipation means freedom, of course. All right, so I'm just gonna go through it and read it, and we will kind of break down what the paragraphs are doing, what the essay is doing, how you can do this with your essay. All right. Next then, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education. Thus begins Plato's well-known allegory of the cave in the Republic, a dialogue about justice and the ideal society. For Plato, the task of education is to free people from their shackles and show them the way out of imprisonment. His argument hinges on this point. To be educated is to be emancipated, not only individually, intellectually, philosophically, but also socially, politically, and ethically. Education, he contends, is what makes justice possible. All right, so in this intro, or opening paragraph, it's not really even an intro, but we have a sort of background of an idea that's going to be the foundation of the idea for the whole essay. So Eric and the Madam, the writer, is using Plato's philosophy as an entrance into his ideas, Eric's ideas, and the writer's ideas around education and freedom and liberation. Education, he contends, is what makes justice possible. We're going to learn that the writer is going to build from Plato's thesis, right? So the writer's thesis is going to be a little bit more specific and exact, but we're building from this like background of Plato. So remember when we talked about rhetorical positions, this is kind of a ethos, pathos, and logos position because he's logically giving us a connection to a philosopher who helps really inform a lot of our Western thinking, but he's also appealing to this idea that there's an emotional appeal to the reader to understand that education has value beyond just information, right? And then there's an ethical appeal, the idea that perhaps justice, which you could argue is ethically what we should all be aiming for, can come through education. The allegory becomes strangely reversed when considering the cave of the modern prison. Given the deep and systemic failure in the country's educational practices, the classroom doesn't always facilitate emancipation. For some, the classroom is the very mechanism that leads to imprisonment, isolation, and alienation. All right, so we've got a short, specific, direct paragraph here, right? We've got this topic sentence. We've got some context here. We've got an actual direct detail. For some, the classroom is the very mechanism that leads to imprisonment, isolation, and alienation. Because this is such a short paragraph, our evidence or our supporting detail is also kind of the analysis in the closing sentence. So remember, when we talk about structure, you can alter the structure to accommodate your needs. Many times, one sentence will provide multiple functions for the same paragraph. Over the past 40 years, the United States has seen a carceral explosion. The United States is just over 4% of the world's population, but holds 22% of the world's prisoners. It's overwhelmingly, it's home to 2 million prisoners total, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. These inmates are overwhelmingly young men of color, and the majority of them never finish school. A 2003 Bureau of Justice Statistics report titled Education and Correctional Populations reported that 68% of the state prison population then had not received a high school diploma. Only about 13% of inmates in both state and federal prisons had completed some kind of post-secondary education. All right, so we know that there is a deficit of education amongst this population. Also, notice we have some very specific research that's done here, and we have citations. The citations are woven very nicely and easily through the paragraph. So already, let's see, how many paragraphs are we in? This is our third paragraph, and we're getting specific, direct facts and figures and data that supports Eric's kind of exploration of this topic, right? This is a really good way to use research. It does not have to be so formal or stiff. It can be naturally woven in. What's notable about these inmates isn't just that they've fallen out of the education system. In many cases, zero tolerance policies in schools led them down a path that culminated in prison. All right, so once again, if you clicked on this, if you were online reading this, this would link you to another source and the research. But clearly, this person had to do research in order to even mention this, right? So your research is going to come from many different places, and it's not going to, it will form the entire flow of your essay. In what is sometimes called the school to prison pipeline, administrators are ordered to suspend students for infractions as minor as dress code violations and cell phone use. These approaches are a variation of the broken windows policing, again, another piece of evidence and research that took off around the 1980s, especially under the former President Ronald Reagan, and in New York City, the former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and the police commissioner William Bratton. Such punishments, detention, expulsion, and increasingly arrest can set up nearly insurmountable barriers that eventually serve to exclude young people from meaningful participation in society. Felony disenfranchisement, minimal job training, and stifle their development, making them hard and more likely to commit worse crimes upon release. All right, I just want to point something out. If you were writing this for an essay in school, for this essay, you would not be able to hyperlink, so you would be putting in your direct sources into the paragraph. So you'd have a citation after each one of these things that Anthematum has hyperlinked to the citation. I hope that makes sense. What this means is that a disproportionate number of poor people spend their 20s and 30s not in higher education institutions, but in prison. 1 in 10 Black males in their 30s is in prison on any given day, according to the Sentencing Project. This suggests that for these people caught in the incarceration net, the prison and not the university is the rite of passage into adulthood. Yet prison doesn't necessarily have to end these young people's educations. In some cases, it can even mark the beginnings, as I have witnessed during my 8 years in teaching college-level philosophy courses in Texas, New York, and Connecticut. All right, so here we get this personal element. He is going to make an argument about the value of education based on his own experience with it as a teacher in the prisons. One particular encounter has stayed with me through the years. After a lecture and discussion of Descartes' meditations, one of the students, a man named Roy D., lingered. He was a truck driver before he ended up in the Texas prison at which I taught, where public records show he will remain for the rest of his life. After the session, he adjusted his cheap plastic glasses, held together by a piece of tape, and said, "I've never felt so free as I am in this class." Malcolm X, it seems, had a similar experience with education. In his autobiography, he wrote of his own years behind bars. After being frustrated that he could not express what he wanted to convey in letters that he wrote, Malcolm X picked up a dictionary and began to copy every single word. Months passed without me even thinking about being imprisoned. In fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. So now we're getting this argument that education, so remember at the beginning of the essay, Anthematum established this argument from Plato that education and justice are sort of intertwined. Now he's adding this other element that education and mental freedom are intertwined, are connected. Investment in rehabilitative programs like drug counseling and educational programming at the prison has declined in favor of techniques of deterrence such as surveillance, isolation, and punitive control. That means punishment, control through punishment. A 2011 report by the Institute of Higher Education Policy, again, we've got a source here, a citation, and some facts, reported that only 6% of the prison population was enrolled in an education program during 2009 to 2010 academic year. Yet, a 2013 RAND Corporation report found strong evidence that correctional education plays a role in reducing recidivism. Recidivism is a really fancy word for going back to prison. So reducing recidivism means that basically education is directly responsible for decreasing the amount of times a person will go back to prison. In a press release for the report, the project's lead researcher, Lewis Davis, said, "It is clear that providing inmates education programs and vocational training helps keep them from returning to prison and improves their future job prospects. Formerly incarcerated persons who participated in education programs have a 43% lower rate of recidivism." So 43% lower than someone who didn't get education. Like they are 43% less likely to go back to prison. That's huge. The study also found that employment was 13% higher among those who participated in those programs. That's also huge. The study concluded that every $1 spent on prison education translated into 4 or so in savings during the first 3 years post-release. That finding echoed a 2004 study by the UCLA School of Public Policy and Research. While the UCLA study found that $1 million investment in incarceration will prevent about 350 crimes, if not only from the fact of removing people from society, it also concluded that the same investment in education will prevent more than 600 crimes. In other words, prison education provided twice the return that mere imprisonment did. To put this into perspective, consider California, which built 22 prisons since the 1980s and only one University of a California campus. In 2011, 1 year at Princeton University cost $37,000 compared to 1 year at New Jersey State Prison, which cost the state $44,000 per incarcerated person. All right, so now we've got this argumentation. Anthematum is using research to make the argument that prison education is a better investment than punitive or forceful, oppressive measures, right? And he's making it it's very convincing because he has all this data. Numbers aside, so now we're getting into a different argument. Numbers aside, he's maybe, the numbers are kind of a logos argumentation, like appealing to the logic, right? Now we'll see maybe perhaps a different rhetorical position. Numbers aside, the experiences of students and educators should also factor into any assessment of prison education. This sounds like it's going to appeal to our pathos, and maybe ethos too. Cristofino Queada-Leal, the 2011 valedictorian of the Prison University Project in California, has said, "It occurred to me that at San Quentin, the power of education had actually changed the culture within the prison. The more opportunities we in prison have to learn to value education and see possibilities for ourselves, the greater the chance we will break the cycle of incarceration, not just for ourselves, but for future generations to come." A 2011 report by the Correction Association of New York states that prison administrators, program practitioners, and incarcerated persons alike also recount the positive effects of college programs in prisons, providing an incentive for good behavior, producing mature, well-spoken leadership who have a calming influence on other inmates and on correction officers, and reducing the tension and violent interactions between inmates and staff and among inmates. Unfortunately, there is no consistency in the types of educational programs in prisons and jails. They depend on available state funding, if any, and the types of private organizations that have the resources and willingness to participate, as well as specific institutional obstacles that must be overcome before any prison can implement the program from the outside. Often, they depend on the person overseeing the particular prison. I've been lucky to be involved. Again, we get this personal evidence, there's research, but because Anthematum is in a prison, his own personal experience almost becomes part of the research he's using and the data he's using to support his argument. So if you are writing about something personal that you've gone through, experienced, and you also have external research, at least 3 different sources, you can also use your own experience, and you would consider yourself a source in that case. I've been lucky to be involved with programs that have support from higher level administrators. In all of those instances, the warden was convinced of the benefit of having a post-secondary education program inside. But even when prisons offer education, it's not always easy for inmates to access it. Participation is voluntary and can be competitive. Some programs I've worked with involve an application process. In some cases, education can be used as a way of further punishing or controlling the incarcerated because it's an opportunity that officials can threaten to take away. I have had students who have been pressured to follow an order under threat that went something like this: well, if you don't do it, you're not going to class this week. So long as education is conceived as an unearned reward, then a lack of education is conceived as a justifiable punishment. There are also financial factors that can undermine a prisoner's chance of education. For example, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 disallowed incarcerated people to receive federal Pell Grants despite the relatively low cost of the program to the federal government. That left it to the states and private organizations to fund these programs. New York, for example, continued to fund its post-secondary correctional education through the tuition assistance program, but discontinued it once the former governor, George Pataki, took office in 1995. After the ban, nearly all 350 post-secondary programs in prison closed nationwide. All right, so there were post-secondary programs in prisons, and then we've gone backwards in this direction, which is partially why I think this person is writing this essay, to argue the need for it. The data suggests that increasing rather than decreasing these opportunities would save Americans money and make them safer. And data is important since it shows administrators, policymakers, and critics that a program works. But it is something less tangible, difficult to quantify, that's caused Roy's statement to stay with me over the years. How is it that anyone can experience freedom inside a place that is designed to make the person unfree? One answer is that freedom is a private, internal experience of power and understanding. In the case of these inmates, that also means being able to dialogue with the past, express themselves to others, and to imagine and articulate a future. It means actively participating in and contributing to a conversation, a problem, and a solution. It is the experience of being recognized as a whole person, the correction of being a part and cultivation of being a part and the cultivation of being a part. Indeed, when Malcolm X and Roy D. stated that education made them feel free, they described it as an experience they'd never previously had in their lives. To be poor, uneducated, and excluded, as many of Americans' prisoners have always been, is an experience of genuine non-freedom. This is the lesson that Plato teaches. All right, so now he's going back to the intro. Education as emancipation is important not only for the individual criminal, as for anyone else, but for society as a whole. A crime marks a fissure, that means a break or a divide, between an individual and society. Punishment tries to close this fissure and, in the best case scenario, minimize future occurrences. So does education. And it does this by connecting the individual to society. Once the person feels at home in the world, he or she draws it closer, bridging the divide that results from alienation and exclusion, and possibly beginning the process of healing the wound of crime. All right, so this is an excellent example of a way to naturally weave really substantial research into an essay that is interesting, that has a personal element, that is reporting information and also arguing a thesis. The thesis here is education within the walls of prison is a benefit to the individual and to society. And that's a pretty good argument to make, and he proves it, right? And he starts from a premise of an old philosopher, and then he ends by circling back to that philosophy, but he builds from that thesis. So his thesis comes out of Plato's thesis, right? And then he pulls all of this information to support his argument. He also appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos, and he does a fabulous job at that. So I wanted you to see this because more so than the example essays in your book, I think this one does a really good job and a really accessible job. I think that all of you have the ability to write something similar to this if you find the right topic. So again, reread this on your own. Really look at what each paragraph is doing with regard to how it uses both structure, argumentation, and also evidence. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and try to figure out how to stop recording. Stop share. Oh. Stop recording. Okay, bye.